Okay, hi everyone. Um, all right, so I'm back, and I just got done working all night, so I'm like kind of feeling myself. It's code term for drunk. I'm drunk. But I wanted to make a video that deals with sort of addressing a lot of the arguments made by the trans community to justify changing the definitions of woman and man, male and female. All right, so let's just get right into it. So one of the first things I hear all the time is that when you misgender a trans woman, that kills, or a trans person, that kills them because it drives them closer and closer to suicide. This is bullshit. Most third world countries, or countries of most oppressed people, tend to have much lower suicide rates than first world countries. Developed countries tend to have some of the highest. They do have the highest suicide rates in the world. And the trans community in particular has a suicide rate which increases after transitioning versus beforehand. I think beforehand the rate is anywhere between like 36 to 38%, and I've seen quoted after transitioning 40 to 42%. The extent to which a person can pass doesn't seem to have any effect as to whether or not this suicide rate changes. Schizophrenics are the only other population that is comparable to which we'll call transgender people with regard to the frequency of suicides within that population. Schizophrenics have a suicide rate of about I think it's high 30s. And then the Jews during Occupy or Nazi Germany, they are the only other population that has a comparable suicide rate. I've heard, I discussed this with a friend of mine, and she had once discussed, she said to me that maybe that's because in third world countries, people there have a religious belief system that prohibits them from committing suicide, but Judaism does not permit suicide, or at least it didn't during the 40s. They've made kind of some additions to the way that God might perceive suicide in light of psychiatric disorders that might propel you towards suicide. So it's kind of interesting to me that during the 40s, now granted, if I had to deal with Nazis, I probably would kill myself too if I had the ability to. But slaves didn't even have a high suicide rate. And the reality is, if you go to suicide.org, they say 90% of all suicides are typically the result of a comorbid illness that wasn't properly addressed, such as depression or anxiety, or paranoia or schizophrenia. So it's just not a valid argument to say that bullying is what's pushing these people to suicide. Perhaps it's a psychiatric illness that's underlying, that's pushing them to suicide, that hasn't been treated properly because they're only being treated for the gender dysphoria. Depression doesn't even have, the population of all depressed people doesn't even have a suicide rate comparable to what we see in the transgender community. Okay, so now let's get into some arguments for justifying being born in a woman in a man's body. The first one that is the most out there is soul theory. Now, this is the idea that you're reincarnated into a male's body as a female, but the reality is soul theory is very complicated. So if you really believe this, what you're really talking about is occultism. And so, when you get into the occult, it's its own doctrine, okay? So it's just like how the transgender community, whenever you discuss these things with them, they always say to you, well, you need to educate yourself, and you say, okay, well, one, I might actually be educated in this, have you thought of that? But two, what they're implying is that you need to read the literature associated with their community, their culture, okay? And so that's what soul theory requires you to do. So if you really believe this, go look at your natal chart. I don't know, maybe you have like hard aspects between like Saturn and your moon, or Saturn and Venus or something, or maybe moon and Venus are in your 12th house, or maybe Venus is conjunct your sun. Or ascendant, I don't know. You should go look at your natal chart. You should take that natal chart to several astrologers, get their take on it. However, soul theory does not allow you to do whatever it is you want to do. It's actually very unforgiving. So, this is not the doctrine to use if you want to justify your feelings. The implication would be, okay, let's say you were a woman in a past life, and now you're born into a male's body. You are supposed to work out whatever karma it is you have in this body. This whole thing is part of your path, okay? So if you're going to argue that point, then you cannot be pissed off at other people criticizing you, or wow, you can get pissed off at them for criticizing you, but you can't get pissed off at somebody simply asking the question of why do you think it's justifiable for you to call yourself a female when you have a penis? You know, you can't say that that's because you were a woman in a past life. Soul theory would push for this notion that you're in this body now as a male, and you have to honor that, and you have to live your life as a male now, you know, and get through this life in that way, and burn off any karma that you have to take care of in this life as a male. You know, perhaps you might argue that transitioning is part of your path, but then that's just it. You know, we're not arguing about having separate terms for trans women. That's fine. We're arguing about, you know, trying to redefine women and female in such a way that it can incorporate men and males. Doesn't make any sense. And soul theory is not the way to justify it, because soul theory still requires you to take responsibility for your own shit. And it really doesn't care about how you feel. I mean, you know, this idea, cult is pretty much just like, you can go to hell if you need to. Like, we don't need to cater to you. We don't need you. Like, your soul doesn't really matter as much as you think it does. It only matters to you. Or God. You know, it don't matter us. You know, this is, we're going to get into, like, you know, elements and the earth and all that stuff. The earth does not give a fuck about you. You know, God, if you believe in it, is the only one that cares about you. Satan doesn't. You know, Satanism, do what thou wilt, that whole theory. I mean, yeah, that's great and all, but that's so that Satan can collect your soul at the end of your life. I mean, whatever they tell you, that's what the actual end game is. So, you know, if people are interested in the occult, or they're interested in any of this, you know, these notions of karma and reincarnation, I could debate that all the livelong day, but that gets very jargony and very esoteric, you know, pretty quickly. And so, you know, if that's what your doctrine is, you got to know your literature, right? Okay, so let's drop that. Soul theory is just, and also legislation can never be written to account for or accommodate past lives or future lives. I mean, that's fucking ridiculous. So, dumb argument. Okay, the next one would be sexism. All right, sexism is an interesting one, because I've heard this. And sexism applies to women. It doesn't apply to males. It doesn't apply to trans women. You might argue as a trans woman you suffer from perhaps discrimination that's gender-based. Okay, well, that's fine. That's gender-based discrimination. That's not sexism. Sexism is the perception of you having a vagina and, excuse me, being able to manipulate you, or this perception that you're inferior for whatever reason, and that reason actually is your vagina. I hate to think of trans women trying to argue that they experience sexism, because the reality is their genitalia is you know, it's a privilege, really. That's what they're born into. They have the genitalia that is the more respected kind, you know. So it's not sexism they experience. They experience gender-based discrimination. And the language is important here, because, you know, sexism is assuming that an entire sex cannot accomplish the same things as the other sex. You know, sexism is assuming that there are gender stereotypes associated with each sex. And so if we're going to argue about sexism, I mean, essentially then everything that trans women are doing is sexist. They're implying that all of these stereotypes associated with womanhood are what actually define womanhood. That's sexist. And so it's just like another moot point. It's like, don't argue that point, because if you're going to go there, then I'm going to say that being sexist is assuming that there's a set of stereotypes or stereotypical roles or behaviors or appearances associated with womanhood. That's sexist. And you are promoting that image, and you're, you know, basically facilitating the ease with which one discriminates against women who do not fit the stereotypical, you know, presentation of womanhood. Okay. Next, and the way that I would account for this, by the way, is because I really do have, obviously, I have issues with calling any person that has a penis a female. I believe that after if you get sex reassignment surgery and you have a vagina, then yeah, sure, then we can call you a female, because I don't have to worry about you putting your penis inside of me and raping me and impregnating me. And that's where this, you know, this comes down to safety, okay, is what it really comes down to. So when we talk about sharing locker rooms or changing spaces, with males. It's not the trans women that are even the problem necessarily. It's the people that clearly are not trans women who do not have to worry about pretending to be trans women, really, aside from just saying I'm a trans woman, because the legislation is so murky or so obscure or so ambiguous that you cannot differentiate between who really is or is not transgender. And so now all of a sudden you create a kind of pocket for all these voyeuristic or creepy dudes to kind of come into any space where we're getting changed. And he doesn't even have to assault us. He could just sit there and stare at us and put in his mental spank bank for later. But the reality is, too, predatory groups are important here. The predatory class against women throughout history has been men. Men are our predators. They're the exact population that has made it a requirement for us to have these separate spaces and these separate facilities. We discuss rape culture in this country, and I think it's really interesting because whenever you bring up these arguments about how, men are our predators, people always like to bring up the fact that when you talk about intimate partner violence, heterosexual couples, women in heterosexual couples tend to experience it less than women in lesbian couples. Well, so what? We're not discussing intimate partner violence. We're discussing, sex. Okay, we're discussing your genitalia. We're discussing rape. We're discussing who gets to impregnate whom. There is not a lot of statistics abound regarding rape. I mean, of course, they don't have to be the most accurate in the world to prove the fact that just on average, we don't hear a lot of cases, or there aren't a lot of cases statistically, of lesbians randomly raping women in locker rooms. Physical violence is a completely different thing from rape. Rape is not only necessarily a problem because of its sexual and abusive nature, but it's also a problem when you have to worry about being impregnated. Okay? So, it's it's just not, again, it's another red herring. Whenever somebody brings up intimate partner violence into this debate about women being raped throughout history and having to worry about that and requiring separate changing facilities so they can worry a little bit less about it, that's something that is completely separate from intimate partner violence. Okay, next thing. Okay, so then the other argument that I always hear from liberals is that, I don't know, you don't support trans people, do you also not support black people either? And you're like, why are you talking about black people? It's the same thing with intersex. It's like, why are you talking about intersex right now? Intersex is a completely separate condition from transgenderism, okay? Transgender people are not intersex people. Intersex people are not a third sex either. So they don't really disprove the sexual dimorphism thing. Intersex people are people that are born with genotypic and or phenotypic qualities or characteristics associated with both sexes. So they have characteristics pulled from both sexes, okay? Phenotypic expression is what you see whenever you see a person naked or in real life, whatever. Your physical expression is your phenotype, okay? So it'd be kind of like if and then your genotype is the genetic code that then codes your body to create the phenotypic expression. So your genetic code would be like if you write a computer program, you code something in, and then that code is being used to then print something out on a 3D printer. The thing that comes out of the 3D printer, that's the phenotypic expression, and then the code that you put in, obviously, is the genotypic expression. Jamie Lee Curtis is an example of somebody who has a genotype that's male. It's masculine. This is the correct usage of masculine. It's masculine because it's referring to something that's sex-linked regarding her biology, okay? So the masculine genotype that I think that Jamie Lee Curtis has, I believe that she just has XY, which would typically be a male, correct? But she has androgen insensitivity, or she doesn't produce testosterone. There's something. There's a mutation on her Y chromosome that hasn't allowed her to express the phenotypic expressions typically associated with being a male. And as such, she actually has a female or a feminine phenotype, but she has a masculine or male genotype. She's intersex. Intersex people have their own sort of unique experience that they should be allowed to live without that experience being conflated with being trans. And that also implies that every person who's born intersex then must be transgender, which they're not. And it's kind of offensive to imply that. And furthermore, a lot of people that are born intersex turn out to be sterile. So there's no reproductive advantage to being intersex, so far as I know. Maybe somebody can correct me on this. So it's not a third sex. And, when people make that argument, they neglect one marginalized group's lived experiences, and that would be the intersex community. When they bring in the black community suddenly, or minorities, into the argument of transgender politics, it's kind of a weird approach, because the reality is this. Poor women, minorities, female minorities, are the most likely to have to stay in homeless shelters, the most likely to have to stay in women's shelters, the most likely to have to stay in prisons, okay? I'm pretty sure that there are no women who have been recently traumatized or abused by men who are going to want to share sleeping quarters or a jail cell with a trans dyke lesbian. That's a masculine trans woman who is likes other women. I wouldn't want to share that space with that person. It doesn't sound very safe. I wouldn't want to have to share a public shower with that person. I wouldn't want to have to share a locker room with a male who has a penis intact and has no interest in having it removed, no interest in reassignment surgery, and calls himself a trans dyke who's a lesbian. Yeah, that sounds like no fun to me. I certainly wouldn't want to get dressed and have my kids get dressed around that, young daughters and such. No. I don't think that there's anything wrong with saying that either. Okay, next thing is biology. Alright, so this is where people, I don't want to talk about biology, there's no biological basis for male and female, they're fucking retarded. Of course there's a biological basis for male and female, you morons. What they don't realize is, okay, so if you're going to argue biological basis in male and female based on feminine mind theory, what you're implying then is still biological essentialism, except that it's brain-based as opposed to genital-based. So you mean to tell me that you know more about what's going on in a person's mind from the day they're born than you can know based on just looking at their genitalia? Yeah, that's rich. Yeah, so I have yet to find a neuroscience study or a study regarding fMRI scans or comparing, male and female brains that proves that there's a huge difference between male and female brains. I've yet to read one study that wasn't complete garbage. I am going to do a recording that goes through those because some of them are just so ridiculous. It's insane. So I have to go through it because it just would be fun, But there are some research studies that are done that are really well done that are meta-analyses. Now, instead of having a sample population of 20 people, putting them in an fMRI scanner as adults, a population that probably already has a ton of variability, they do in certain papers, and then trying to say that there's some vast difference between males and females when you're okay, well, your population size is 20 people. I want to see these differences exposed between children before puberty. After they've lived 20-some odd years of their life and they've already been socialized, that's when you're going to choose to try to show that there are differences. Yeah, of course. I would assume that there will be, yeah. But I would like to see it in children. I want to know that this is from a young age. If you're going to argue that they're born this way, it's kind of odd to me that nobody who's trying to advocate for the trans community has kind of made this claim. That they've done a study with a bunch of kids and they still see the differences because they don't exist. And in a lot of the papers, or not a lot, I shouldn't say that, but I can think of two papers that I've read where the p-values for the takeaway message weren't even that great. One was 0.8, one was 0.65, not 0.065, not 0.08, 0.83, 0.65. Very interesting to me that they're still using those studies and basically making conclusions as if the results that they had found were actually significant, which they weren't. But so, again, we're taking the biological essentialism away from the genitalia and instead placing it in the mind. Some people, I've read this argument, which I thought was really bizarre. One argument was well, when you have a kid, even if you have a kid, they're not going to know who the parent is. So even if you know who you are with your with your cellular DNA, your kid's not going to know which parent is which. And I'm like, well, yeah, they could, because they could get the DNA from both parents and test their mitochondrial DNA. So let's say like you have two parents that are lesbians. One is a post-op trans woman who saved her sperm and then artificially inseminated the mother, who obviously grew full term and gave birth. Now, if they had made the choice to not tell their child who was who, like who carried the child, the child could still eventually find out if she had or he had both parents' DNA by testing his or her mitochondrial DNA. And the next thing is, all right, so here's where, this is the piece de resistance, okay? So liberals should not be arguing that we should be changing the definitions of male and female. Of all people. I'm tired for a really good reason. And that is this. If you're a liberal person, are you a creationist? Oof. I mean, I would think your answer is no. All right, so if you're not a creationist, you believe in evolutionary biology, right? You believe in Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection. Wow. Natural selection requires sexual dimorphism. And when you start to think about it, we're mammals, aren't we? There are a ton of mammals, and they all have a male and a female. All mammals have two sexes, okay? All of them. There's not one asexual mammal, period. The way that natural selection works is this. The idea is that you have certain mutations that happen to your genes that are advantageous to survival and those that are deleterious to survival. So before there was sexual dimorphism, the idea is that there's asexuality. So asexual organisms could just pop off a part of themselves and give birth. It sounds great, right? Oh, that's awesome. You would think that there's selective advantage to that, right? But there's not, because the reality is if you have a mutation, then all of a sudden, all you can make copies of are your mutated genes, which is no bueno. But if you don't, if you have sexual dimorphism, one person contributing the genetic material or one organism contributing the genetic material might have a mutation that's bad, but the other person might have a healthy gene. And so then it's like kind of like, 50-50. In certain cases, this gets complex if you want to get further and further into genetics, but the reality is sexual dimorphism allows for you to be protected against benign, or not even benign, but random mutations that can cause some harm, but you might need two of them. So most genetic mutations that cause diseases tend to be recessive. There are very few dominant genes, or dominant mutations that cause, mutations to dominant genes. I'm sorry, it's just very late and I'm very tired. So in any case, natural selection requires you to accept sexual dimorphism. If you neglect it or if you deny it, then you cannot come to the conclusion that human beings exist as a result of natural selection. So primates, our evolutionary ancestors, are sexually dimorphic. The idea is that we came into existence because more and more, intelligent beings were being born, okay, and evolving. And ideally, they had selective advantage, meaning they could survive more easily than all the other creatures around them. So they continued to survive and they continued to procreate until the next generation came along and at some point killed them. That's the idea behind natural selection. And, again, I can't say it enough, but you have to accept sexual dimorphism in order to accept natural selection. It's quite that simple. And not only that, male and females, these concepts don't exist just within the humans. And to divorce ourselves from all the other animal kingdom, or the rest of the animal kingdom, just so we can accommodate the transgender community, it's absurd. It is truly absurd. When I was younger, I used to worry about conspiracy theories and all this stuff, and then I just got to a point where I was like, oh, it's gonna be fine. Like, what am I worried about? No, I hate that I've woken up to this shit, because this is not a theory. This is in my face reality. I mean, this is me being confronted by people who are college-educated liberals who constantly bash conservatives for being insane. This is batshit crazy to argue that we should change the definitions of male and female, or that, the concepts of male and female are these concepts that are debatable or intangible, or made up in your mind, but then by the same token you're going to argue for something like a female mind and a male mind. I mean, that's insane. It's insane for any number of reasons, not the least of which is that you're taking away the vocabulary that describes our core biology. I mean, this is the language used to describe our very core of ourselves. And you want to strip us of the ability to articulate who we are as human beings and how we relate to our evolutionary ancestors, how we relate to the rest of the animal kingdom, how we relate to the rest of the planet, and you wonder why the planet is in the state that it's in right now. We're not in contact with nature anymore. When you can divorce yourself from nature so much that you no longer can reason with yourself as to why a male cannot have a vagina and why a female cannot have a penis, you can't figure that out. And then you're going to sit here and discuss, oh, the world is just so corrupt, it's so messed up because, we're out of touch with nature. Yeah, no shit. Do you think? And it's insane to me that it's liberals who are making these arguments and not conservatives. Conservatives like, no, fuck y'all crazy. In what world did I think that I'd be sitting there talking, this just happened to me the other day. I was talking to a conservative, hardcore conservative, and they're nuts. They're hardcore Trump supporter. I can't relate to them on that level. But I'm talking to them about this whole ordeal, and they're like, oh yeah, those people are crazy. And actually it was funny because they were the one that brought this back up to me, that I was like, holy shit, yeah, that's so true. Because I've argued this in so many ways, but then I was like, I didn't even think about natural selection. Why wouldn't I even think about that? And they're like, well, yeah, I'm not a creationist. I'm a conservative, but I'm not a creationist. Natural selection, I thought you guys thought that this shit was real. Is Charles Darwin a turf? It's a fucking crazy. And the biggest issue with this is that the people that are going to be most harmed by this are going to be poor people. They're going to be people who cannot, they don't have the 2 generations from now, 20 years from now, poor people that don't have access to a fantastic education, poor people who are not able to sit there and intellectualize their genitalia or intellectualize, their sex organs. They're not going to be able to have the language that one needs to understand the concept of natural selection, to understand the concept of evolution, but evolutionary biology. They're going to sit there and wonder, oh, I wonder why dogs who have penises are always males, but somehow, humans can have vaginas. Natural selection isn't based on gender identity. Animals were not picking each other. They were not picking out their sex mates based on gender identity. There's no gender identity politics within the hierarchy of the animal kingdom. They pretty much are just like, we do what we got to do to survive. Female species tend to do this. The female sex of all the species tend to do these things to survive. The male species of the sex tend to do these things to survive. And that's how, gender stereotypes grew out of our sex, our sexuality and our genitalia. That's where gender stereotypes come from. But, to say that, yeah, of course, gender stereotypes are bad, we're not fixing them with this. You're essentially saying if you want to take on the gender stereotypes of the opposite sex, then you have to become the opposite sex. It's crazy. But not only that, you're trying to obfuscate the language used to describe biology, their core biology, to describe ourselves. And the people who will suffer most from this are going to be the people who do not have access to the education that we take for granted nowadays. We take this shit for granted. I mean, this is a product of just being completely gluttonous with regard to information. I mean, you have access to so much fucking information at your fingertips as a upper middle class white person, which by the way is the major demographic that supports this trans movement. Okay, you rich kids have a fucking smartphone. I mean, not even rich. I mean, I'm not rich, and I have a fucking smartphone in my hand, and I can literally Google what the definition of a woman is. I can Google what natural selection is. I can Google evolutionary biology. I mean, these are all things that we take for granted because we have such ease of access to them, and because we come from a generation that knows what the definition of male and female is, so we can sit here and discuss it and debate it and wonder what it really means. Meanwhile, it's at our fucking fingertips, and we're just shitting all over it by saying, like, well, I just don't really know. I don't know. I don't really know. Yes, you fucking do. Use some common sense. Wake up. This is just ridiculous. The fact that we have to sit here and take the time to argue about this, given all the other shit that's going on in the world. I have to, because this is a pretty fucking big deal. You know, you want to change the very essence of what it means to be a human being, the very essence of our biological history. You want to change that. I think that this is probably the most important issue at the time, because most people outside the LGBTQ community are not hearing about this. Okay, they're not hearing about any of this shit. And they're going to wake up in a reality where this has been all written into legislation, and they're going to wonder, how did I get my biology stripped from me? How did this happen? You know, I already wonder that, and I've been following this for some time. But I'm not approaching this from the LGBTQ community, thank God, because I haven't been indoctrinated. I'm approaching this from the scientific community. You know, I've been indoctrinated in the scientific community. That's fine, because at least I can still logically think for myself. You know, it's not a doctrine that discourages you from discussing things. It's not a doctrine that basically tells any person who doesn't go, you know, with the flow or tries to go against the grain in the community, it doesn't tell them that they have to leave, you know, that they have to be banished from the community, never to speak of it ever again, and never to associate themselves with the community ever again. You know, all these people that are detransitioning, it's like the trans community is kind of like, oh, well, they were never really trans to begin with. And it's like, fuck you, you know, how can you say that? It's sad. And I know that there are people out there who, you know, I see these videos on YouTube of these kids who are transitioning, and some of them are very heartfelt and they're struggling. You know, I don't want to take your transitioning away from you. That's one thing. You, sure, if that is making you feel better, then by all means do it. But I would like a society where you don't have to transition to just take on this gender stereotypes of the opposite sex. You don't have to call yourself trans to wear a dress as a male. You know, you can tell yourselves whatever you like, but the fact of the matter is we have not yet tried to approach society in that way. We've never tried it. You know, how would it feel if you went to go see a psychiatrist and they said, oh, you're a male, likes to wear a dress? Well, there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. You know, if you want to do that, that's fine. And you just go through, okay, well, then fine. If that's okay, then let me try wearing nail polish and makeup and stuff. And as a society, we just have to let you figure it all out. That's fine. I would wholeheartedly support that. You know, wholeheartedly, I would support you know, maybe adding another category on all of our identifying information. You know, in addition to sex, we also have gender identification, you know, so that you can say, oh, I'm a male, but I'm a trans woman as well. Those would be the things that I think would be worth advocating for. But I'm not going to advocate for this change of language. It's not going to fucking happen. And if you have any soul whatsoever, you're not a complete sociopath or psychopath, then you should not be advocating for this either, because it divorces us from our biology. It divorces us from the rest of the animal kingdom. It divorces us from any ability to articulate our ancestral history as human beings with regard to our biology. You know, you take this shit for granted. Charles Darwin wrote, you know, Charles Darwin died, when? Late 1800s. Mid-1800s, actually, I think. So it's like, you know, Origin of Species, I think, was published in, what, early 1800s, 1830s, I believe? I can't remember. It's been years since I've even really thought about Origin of Species, because this is such a basic concept of biology. You know, but they at least did, they didn't know what the reality was with regard to you know, procreation, evolution. You know, they didn't know how babies are made. They truly didn't. There are all types of wacky theories, you know. Sperm carried little humans inside of it that grew up. You know, we take it for granted. You know, in the 60s, they didn't know what DNA looked like. They didn't know what the double helix was until the middle of the 20th century. You know, we just take this stuff as if like we've always known it. Now it's time to start questioning what it really means to be a man. I mean, can we, like, we've had enough already. I mean, like, we've had enough of this genetic stuff and evolutionary biology stuff. Can we start questioning what it means to be male or female already? Jesus, let's get on with the show. It's like, no, you motherfuckers. Male and female, they stay. They mean that you have sex characteristics, you know, associated with either being a male or a female, and we can determine these along a long continuum of mammals. Okay, mammals are sexually dimorphic, and that's how we came to these conclusions that all males from the mammalian class tend to have these features, and all females from the mammalian class tend to have these features. That's how we came to these conclusions. You know, it wasn't random. It wasn't random. It wasn't arbitrary assignments. You know, maybe the language itself is arbitrary. Okay, fine, that's arguable. But the reality is, so the fuck what? We've been using this language to describe mammals for how long now? You know, it's just asinine. It's bizarre. It just feels sad and depressing. Because I just feel like we shouldn't be here. We shouldn't be here because we could be advocating for the same things. We could be fighting for the same things. We could, you know, stop squabbling between each other. But it's just the most ridiculous notion to think that we should be arguing that males can have penises. Well, that's where we're going with this, right? That females can have penises and that males can have vaginas. It's bizarre to even think that we would get this far off course of what it means to be human. And this day and age, with such ease of access to information. This is where the fuck we are. It's crazy. Yeah. I'm sorry, I just got distracted because this Frank Ocean album is so good. This is Blonde. And it's so fucking good. This whole album is so good. I'm wrapping it up there anyway because I don't know what the fuck to say after that. Natural selection, bitches! Precludes us from changing the definitions of male and female just to, you know, accommodate the feels of trans women. Yeah. Alright guys, sorry I was so aggressive at the end. You know, I don't know. I'll try to be nicer next time. I'm skipping showers and switching socks, sleeping good and long.